the 9,700 and 20th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is maintenance of peace and security of Ukraine. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's provisional rules of procedure, I am representative Lithuanian to in accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's provisional rules of procedure, I also invite Ms. Joyce Msuya, Acting Under Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Acting Emergency Relief Coordinator, to participate in this meeting. Of the European Union to the United Nations to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of the item of the agenda.
They undoubtedly require urgent health care, medicine, food, and clean drinking water. 24,600 civilians have been injured. And across the country, 10 million people have now been forced to flee their homes. Since 26 August, large-scale attacks and relentless missile and drone strikes have continued across Ukraine. More civilians, including children, have been killed and injured, and more essential infrastructure has been damaged. According to local authorities in the Donetsk region, almost half the residents of a frontline town in their area have evacuated in the last 2 weeks. Several hospitals in the region have also had to relocate, making health services scarce amidst growing needs for people who remain. Mr. President, while civilians in frontline areas of Donetsk and parts of Kyiv are among those most heavily impacted, attacks elsewhere in Dnipro, Kyiv, Lviv, Poltava, and other cities have also caused significant civilian casualties and damage to essential infrastructure. Large-scale and systematic strikes against Ukraine's energy infrastructure continue to drastically reduce electricity capacity, causing millions of people countrywide to experience daily power cuts. Outages often last many hours and limit access to water, sewage, heating, mobile networks, internet, and public transportation. They hinder the ability of hospitals and health facilities to operate. They add to the disruption of children's education. The start of the new school year has been marred by constant attacks and damage to schools. And they imperil vulnerable and marginalized groups, especially older people and those with limited mobility. This toll will be amplified over the winter as energy needs increase. Mr. President, we should also not underestimate the long-term psychological impacts of these relentless hostilities. Civilians across Ukraine are spending endless hours in bomb shelters as air raid sirens sound and as they wait for the missiles to stop. People living in regions along the front line often spend days on end sheltering from the fighting, and millions of Ukrainians face death, destruction, and the fear of attack on a daily basis. Nor should we ignore the disproportionate impact of the war on women and children who continue to face additional barriers to accessing essential services and increased risks to their safety, including from gender-based violence. Mr. President, we are deeply concerned by the recent expansion of fighting to new areas on both sides of the Ukraine-Russia border. Since Ukraine's military operation into the Kursk region of the Russian Federation on 6th of August, at least 130,000 civilians have been evacuated, according to local Russian officials. Media reports indicate civilian casualties and damage to civilian infrastructure. I must remind all parties of the obligation to take constant care to spare civilians and civilian objects as international humanitarian law demands. Mr. President, the escalation in military activity and the shifting front lines are making humanitarian operations extremely dangerous and exposing aid workers to serious harm. Nevertheless, humanitarian organizations continue to assist hundreds of thousands of people in need. In the first 7 months of 2024, some 6.2 million people received humanitarian assistance in Ukraine. Humanitarians are providing support to thousands of people in frontline communities, emergency relief and relocation support to those evacuating, and improving living conditions for internally displaced people in collective sites. And ahead of winter, our winter response plan and preparedness efforts are proceeding at full speed. Here, I want to pay tribute to the courage of all humanitarian workers in Ukraine, particularly the local volunteers, civil society organizations, and other groups who risk their lives to provide this support and who keep humanity alive amid the death and destruction. Mr. President, we remain deeply concerned about the 1.5 million people who we have been unable to reach at any adequate scale in regions of Ukraine occupied by the Russian Federation, in parts of Donetsk, Kherson, Luhansk, and Zaporizhia. Like all others living in frontline areas of Ukraine, they undoubtedly require urgent health care, medicine, food, and clean drinking water. As winter approaches, these needs will become more acute. We renew our call for the safe, rapid, and unimpeded passage of humanitarian relief to all civilians in need in accordance with international humanitarian law. Mr. President, we are grateful to the donors who so far this year have provided almost $1.4 billion for the humanitarian response in Ukraine. However, 3/4 of the way through the year, the humanitarian needs and response plan is still less than half funded. To sustain operations in an increasingly complex and dangerous environment, we urgently need donors to increase and accelerate flexible funding for the response. This is even more pressing as another winter approaches. This war has gone on far too long. It has caused immense suffering and left more than 14.6 million people, or 40% of Ukraine's population, in need of humanitarian assistance. As it escalates, its toll will only increase. Protecting civilians and ultimately ending this war is a matter of will. As heads of state and government leaders prepare to attend the 79th session of the UN General Assembly, opening today, I once again call on Council members, indeed all member states, to seize every opportunity to secure the decisions that will spare civilians and finally bring this war to an end. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Msuya for her briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of France.
Mr. President, I wish to thank Madam Msuya for her briefing. The Security Council met more than 20 times to address the humanitarian situation in Ukraine since Russia's illegal aggression on the 24th of February 2022. This is the 7th time we are meeting on this year. Russia has an obligation to respect international humanitarian law and the humanitarian principles of distinction and proportionality. Russia must cease its strikes against civilians and civilian infrastructure. Despite this, it continues to methodically target civilian objects each day, striking schools, hospitals, nurseries, kindergartens, shopping centers, mass transit, residential buildings. We have not forgotten the massacres of the Kramatorsk station, the Venezia building, the printing plant in Kharkiv, the hospital, the children's hospital in Akhmadit in Kyiv, and the commercial center and the shopping mall in Konstantinovka. Russia has been striving to break the resilience of the Ukrainian people, and there have been repeated large-scale salvos targeting all of Ukrainian territory on the 26th and 27th of August, and then again in September, targeting critical energy infrastructure as winter approaches. We condemn the export by Iran and the acquisition by Russia of ballistic missiles. This constitutes a flagrant violation of Resolution 2231. Iranian missiles will further compound the suffering of the Ukrainian people. Mr. President, and these missiles may target European soil. Strikes deep within the territory, far from front lines, are not targeting military infrastructure, rather civilian infrastructure. These are practices which run counter to IHL, and therefore the ICC issued on 5 March 2024 2 arrest warrants against Sergei Ivanovich Koblych, Lieutenant General of the Russian Air Force, and Mr. Sokolov, Vice Admiral Commandant of the Navy, for the missile strikes against Ukrainian civilian infrastructure. The plight of 1.5 million Ukrainians in occupied territories is alarming. Since the first day of the war of aggression, Russia's war of aggression, France has supported Ukraine and neighboring countries to addressing the humanitarian consequences of the conflict. France has mobilized more than 400 million euros to address humanitarian urgent humanitarian needs and to help rebuild essential infrastructure. Russia is culpable of multiple violations of human rights in occupied territories and violations of IHL against Ukrainian prisoners of war. Russia, once again, it has been designated in the Secretary General's annual report on children in armed conflict. Russia has been responsible for killing, maiming, and attacks against schools and hospitals. President Putin has been the object of an arrest warrant of the ICC for presumed crimes of deportation and illegal transfer of children. And I wish to remind all states parties to the Rome Statute of their obligation to comply with the arrest warrant. For 900 days, more than 900 days, we have denounced the magnitude and the gravity of crimes perpetrated by Russia in Ukraine. It must be held accountable. It is past time for Russia to cease flouting obligations and to end its war of aggression. Thank you.
The representative of France for the statement. And now I give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Gracias.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I thank the Acting Under-Secretary General, Ms. Joyce Mansuya, for her report. Since the last time that this council met to receive a report on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine, we have witnessed concerning developments on the ground, developments which have exacerbated tensions and which continue to gravely affect the civilian population. Of particular concern have been the detailed reports received by Ms. Masuya today regarding the number of civilian victims in Ukraine, as well as the damage to critical infrastructures arising from recent missile and drone attacks. Moreover, we are equally concerned about the negative impact on the civilian population, with tens of people being killed and wounded, and the evacuation of hundreds of thousands of people as a result of the expansion of the geographical scope of the conflict, both in Ukraine and in Russia. Attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure are unacceptable, regardless of where they occur. Ecuador reiterates that it is imperative that we protect the lives of civilians and safeguard civilian infrastructure in accordance with the principles and mandates of international humanitarian law, particularly those provisions and mandates which demand that parties to a conflict act with distinction, proportionality, and precaution. Moreover, parties must act with the utmost sense of responsibility and avoid any act which may imperil the security and safety of nuclear power plants in Ukraine and Russia in order to avoid immeasurable humanitarian and environmental disaster. Elsewhere, I once again recognize the efforts of the United Nations and its humanitarian partners who continue to provide vital assistance to those affected, this in spite of the risks to which they expose themselves. Parties must protect humanitarian workers and guarantee unimpeded access of humanitarian aid to the most affected areas in accordance with Resolution 2730 of this Council. Mr. President, as was indicated quite rightly by Assistant Secretary General Miroslav Sienka in this chamber a few days ago, after a decade of conflict in the east of Ukraine and after the occupation of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol, and after 2.5 years of the aggression, the suffering of the Ukrainian people continues unabated. Consequently, we must not allow this war to be normalized, in spite of the fact that reports on the horrors of the conflict are being published with increasing frequency. We cannot lose sight of the fact that behind every figure there are human lives cut short, families destroyed, and entire communities that have been uprooted. Ecuador urges this Council to work in favor of de-escalation and towards a cessation of hostilities. We're doing our part. We reiterate our appeal for the cessation of violence, for the protection of civilians to be guaranteed, and for the resumption of dialogue and diplomacy so that we can restore peace within the framework of the respect for the territorial integrity and political independence of Ukraine and in accordance with the UN Charter, international law, and the resolutions of the General Assembly. Thank you.
Thank the representative of Ecuador for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of China.
President, I thank Acting Under-Secretary General Masuya for her briefing. The continued fighting in Ukraine has resulted in an increasingly dire humanitarian situation and the constant risks of spillover effects. The prolonged conflict has brought significant sufferings to civilians on both sides and given rise to a serious humanitarian crisis. The continuation of war will only lead to more harm and destruction and make the regional and international situation even more volatile. Achieving an early ceasefire and seeking a political solution are in the interest of all parties. The priority now is to observe the three principles of no expansion of the battlefield, no escalation of fighting, and no fanning the flame by any party, so as to de-escalate the situation as soon as possible. China once again calls on all parties to the conflict to remain calm and exercise restraint, effectively observe international law, in particular IHL, avoid targeting civilian and civilian infrastructure, and refrain from attacking nuclear power plants and other peaceful nuclear facilities. We call on parties to the conflict to show political will, meet each other halfway, and launch peace talks without delay. We call on the international community to uphold an objective and just position and create favorable conditions for and facilitate the resumption of direct dialogue and negotiation between the two parties. President, China's position on the Ukraine issue has been crystal clear and consistent, namely promoting peace talks and advocating for political settlement. We always maintain that the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all nations should be respected. The purposes and principles of the UN Charter should be upheld. The legitimate security concerns of all countries should be taken seriously, and all efforts conducive to peaceful settlement should be supported. The more complicated the situation is, the more we must not give up hope for peace. The international community should uphold an objective and just position and send out positive and constructive messages by calling for a ceasefire and resumption of peace talks at an early date. China and Brazil jointly issued the 6 common understandings on political settlement of the Ukraine crisis, which is in line with the common aspiration of the vast majority of countries. Some other developing countries are also working for peace and promoting dialogue and have put forward quite a number of good proposals and suggestions. China stands ready to stay closely engaged with the Global South and the countries concerned in order to play a constructive role in promoting a political settlement to the crisis. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Undersecretary General, Madam Joyce Msuya, for her insightful briefing. At the outset, I would like to reiterate Algeria's deep concern over the continued deterioration of the humanitarian situation caused by the conflict in Ukraine. Despite the numerous calls of the international community to de-escalate tensions and to favor dialogue and diplomacy, this conflict is still fueled by confrontation and military action. As a result, we deplore the continued loss of lives among civilians on both sides of the border. The number of refugees and internally displaced persons keeps growing as civilians continue to flee from conflict areas, trying to find safe shelter for their families. In the meantime, critical civilian infrastructure is still being targeted by military operations. The approaching winter will further complicate the humanitarian situation and prolongs the suffering of millions of people, including women, children, and the elderly. Against this backdrop, Algeria emphasizes the need to respect and uphold the rules of international law, including international humanitarian law. Algeria reiterates its call to the parties to end all hostilities, reverse the trend of bloodshed and destruction, and favor diplomacy and peaceful settlement of disputes. It is critical for both parties, as well as for the international community, to join efforts to lay the ground for inclusive and constructive dialogue and negotiations. Neither confrontation nor polarization did or will take this conflict closer to any peaceful solution. Only a genuine dialogue between the parties could lead to a peaceful political solution based on the principles and purposes of the UN Charter and the legitimate security concerns of all parties. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. I'd like to thank Acting USG Masuya for her briefing today. Colleagues, over 2.5 years since Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, it is the Ukrainian people who continue to bear the terrible consequences of Russia's aggression. 14 million Ukrainians are already in need of humanitarian assistance. Rather than end this suffering, Russia has chosen to sharply increase its attacks on schools and hospitals in recent months. This council met in July to discuss the particularly shocking damage caused by a Russian missile strike on the Okhmedit Children's Hospital. Since then, the situation has only got worse. The UN reports that Russian attacks have led to 184 civilian casualties in the last month in cities and towns across the country. And Russia continues to target key energy facilities across the country. Over 100 attacks since March have caused extended power cuts affecting millions of people. To be clear, direct attacks on civilian infrastructure constitute a war crime. This must end. This constant bombardment and Russia's aggression along the front line and in Ukrainian territory is also complicating the humanitarian response. As reported by OCHA on World Humanitarian Day, Ukraine is now one of the most dangerous contexts in the world for aid workers. There were over 225 incidents that directly impacted humanitarian operations last year, averaging 4 a week. The systemic denial of humanitarian access also means we cannot verify the full scale of violations and abuses being committed against Ukrainian civilians. The UK calls on Russia to comply with all its obligations under international humanitarian law, to take all feasible precautions to protect civilians, and to cease targeting infrastructure that provides the essential needs for Ukraine's population. Until Russia ends its aggression, Ukraine has the right to defend itself under Article 51 of the UN Charter. And in defending itself, Ukraine is defending us all. Ukrainians are risking their lives day in, day out to stand up for the values at the heart of this very institution, the UN, and the right of all our countries to sovereignty and territorial integrity. Mr. President, the UK remains steadfast in its support for Ukraine. We've committed £12.7 billion of support so far, including vital lethal aid, crucial humanitarian assistance, and funding for energy supplies. We will continue to support Ukraine in the face of this appalling aggression. And we reiterate once again our call for Russia to end this brutal war, to withdraw from Ukrainian territory, and to uphold its commitments under the UN Charter. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for their statement. I give the floor to the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you, Acting Undersecretary General Masuya, for your briefing. And thank you to Ecuador and France for calling the Security Council's attention to the humanitarian impact of Russia's recent missile and drone assault on Ukraine. Colleagues, Russia's ongoing aerial assault on Ukraine, which began on August 24, Ukraine's Independence Day, and is the largest since Russia launched its invasion, has killed and injured hundreds of civilians and significantly degraded civilian life. It has exacerbated the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. Just 2 missile strikes against a military educational institute and a hospital in Poltava killed at least 51 people and injured hundreds more. With that, Russia has now destroyed 215 medical facilities, and damaged another 1,646. Remember July, when Russian airstrikes destroyed the Okhmadit Children's Hospital. December 2023, when they damaged a maternity hospital in Dnipro. And in March 2022, when they struck a maternity and children's hospital in Mariupol. The list continues to grow. Russia also continues to attack the electricity grid, power generation, and natural gas infrastructure, leaving Ukraine with a power deficit this coming winter that will leave its citizens in the dark and cold. The damage to infrastructure is also severely restricting access to basic services like clean water. As this humanitarian crisis grows, we ask fellow member states to help defend the UN Charter by holding Russia accountable, by not pushing a peace process that lacks the support of Ukraine or rewards Russia for violating the Charter, and by denying Russia the material support it needs to wage war. We ask member states to provide Ukraine with the means to defend its people and repair its infrastructure. The United States has provided more than $2.6 billion in humanitarian assistance, including support for food, health, shelter, livelihood, protection, and water, sanitation, and hygiene assistance. We encourage other donors to support the humanitarian response through the Ukraine Humanitarian Fund or other partners. Humanitarian needs are just as critical now as at the start of the full-scale invasion. We remain equally committed to Ukraine's energy security. During the June 11-12 Ukraine Recovery Conference, G7 plus partners collectively announced over $1 billion in new energy assistance. We are restoring as much power generation as possible and deploying emergency backup power solutions so Ukraine's people stay warm this winter. We will convene with our Italian partners a G7 plus Ukraine Energy Ministerial later this month to further coordinate and energize those efforts. Colleagues, for some time, the U.S. has warned Iran, publicly and privately, that transferring ballistic missiles to Russia would constitute a dramatic escalation. Russia has now received these missiles and will likely use them within weeks in Ukraine. As a consequence, the United States will announce sanctions later today against Iran. We will also consult with our partners on what additional steps may be needed to respond to this dangerous escalation. To Iran and the DPRK, our message is simple. The world is watching. Your transfer of weapons, especially missiles and drone technology, to Russia is enabling it to carry out its aggression in Ukraine, to kill civilians, and to broadly degrade civilian life. It makes you complicit, and it puts you on the wrong side of history. And as I said before, China cannot have it both ways. China cannot be for peace and the protection of the UN Charter while it enables Russia's war through dual-use imports or by backing a peace process that rewards Russia for invading another member state. We invite China to partner with us in holding Russia accountable for its atrocities in Ukraine and for launching this unjustified, brutal, and unnecessary war. Justice for victims of Russia's aggression is a prerequisite for lasting peace. To uphold the principles of the UN Charter, we must press Russia to end its unprovoked and needless war of conquest and the humanitarian crisis it has caused. Russia must immediately cease its aggression and fully withdraw from all territory within Ukraine's internationally recognized borders. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also thank Acting USG for the timely and informative briefing. I also welcome the participation of representatives of Ukraine, Lithuania, EU, Sweden, and Poland at today's meeting. Once again, we return to this august chamber to address Russia's illegal and unjustifiable war against Ukraine and its people. However, today's meeting takes on a new sense of urgency, considering the escalatory large-scale attacks over the last 2 weeks. Such attacks have targeted civilian infrastructure throughout Ukraine, caused hundreds of civilian casualties, jeopardized nuclear safety and security, and once again laid bare the true face of Russian aggression. Under this alarming backdrop, allow me to focus on the following points. First, the Republic of Korea condemns in the strongest terms the large-scale and lethal Russian missile and drone attacks targeting multiple Ukrainian cities, including residential buildings, hospitals, schools, malls, hotels, religious institutions, and even an orphanage. This includes the disgraceful September 3rd attack on a hospital in Poltava and the September 4th attack on Lviv, which is Ukraine's westernmost city, far from the front line and long regarded as a safe space for civilians and aid workers. This underscores that nowhere in Ukraine is safe. I take this opportunity to extend our deepest condolences to the victims. Second, let me reiterate that Russia's ongoing wanton and indiscriminate attacks against civilians and civilian objects across Ukraine, including energy infrastructure, constitute flagrant violations of international law, including international humanitarian law. My delegation is gravely dismayed by recent media reports that present evidence of a summary execution of Ukraine POWs by Russian forces. The international community should demonstrate its resolute stance that those responsible for such heinous acts must be held fully accountable. We are also concerned by the ominous humanitarian threat of prolonged winter blackouts as the days get increasingly shorter and the temperatures continue to fall. Third, Russia's arms transactions with the DPRK are not only illegal, contravening multiple Security Council resolutions, they are also deadly. The DPRK has now sent more than 13,000 containers carrying munitions to Russia since September of last year. At the same time, at least dozens of North Korean ballistic missiles have been fired thus far. The number and the targeted areas of Russia's attacks using North Korean ballistic missiles are increasing in both frequency and intensity. There are as many as 10 UN Security Council resolutions imposing sanctions on the DPRK under Chapter 7 of the Charter since its first nuclear test in 2006, all of which were unanimously adopted in this chamber. However, it is unsettling that the sanctions regime is being seriously eroded as Russia is flagrantly violating these resolutions in its illegal war of aggression in Ukraine. We urge Russia to cease its illegal military cooperation with DPRK and fulfill its duty as a permanent member of the Security Council by ending this war. In closing, Mr. President, the Republic of Korea will continue to stand with the people of Ukraine and provide vital assistance in the areas of security, humanitarian aid, and reconstruction until they achieve just and lasting peace in their land. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President. I also thank Acting USG Monsieur for her briefing. Since the last time this Council convened to discuss the situation in Ukraine, the situation on the ground has continued to deteriorate. Over the past days, we have witnessed an intensification of Russian missile and drone attacks in several Ukrainian cities. These include a large-scale drone attack on Kyiv that left 50 killed and more than 300 injured. These attacks have continued to add to the death and suffering that the Ukrainian population has been forced to endure since the Russian Federation launched its aggression on Ukraine 2.5 years ago, in complete violation of the UN Charter. Malta once again condemns such attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure. We reiterate our unwavering position that civilians must be protected and that international humanitarian law must be respected by all parties at all times. Meanwhile, the humanitarian situation in the country continues to deteriorate. This is deeply worrying. Malta extends its deep appreciation to OSHA and all humanitarian actors currently working on the ground. We call on the Russian Federation to facilitate the distribution of aid and access to all humanitarian workers in accordance with international humanitarian law. As is always the case, children are also paying an extremely heavy price. Too many Ukrainian children have been killed. Those who have survived are left to suffer the brunt of war. They are left to deal with the loss of parents and family members, permanent injuries, displacement, long-term trauma, and exploitation. Others have been deported or forcibly transferred, actions that may constitute a war crime or a crime against humanity. President, we will continue to support Ukraine and its right to defend itself in accordance with Article 51 of the UN Charter, as long as this unjustified war of aggression continues. To this end, we reiterate our full support to the mandate of the International Criminal Court, the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, as well as to the register of damages caused by the aggression of the Russian Federation against Ukraine. We once again call on the Russian Federation to stop its attacks on Ukraine and halt its war of aggression. We reaffirm our unwavering support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. The UN Charter is clear on this matter. It is our collective duty to safeguard it. We must redouble our efforts towards a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, first and foremost, prior to beginning my statement, I wish to once again voice the fact that I disagree with your decision to allow 3 member states of the European Union to participate in today's meeting under Rule 37. We have already repeatedly noted that statements from the European Union with the general position of member states on this question during a meeting on Ukraine would suffice entirely. This is all the more disappointing in light of the fact that yourself, sir, at the beginning of your term, assumed the obligation to streamline and optimize issues of participation in Security Council meetings under Rule 37. We see here an example of double standards and inconsistency. Mr. President, we have just heard the latest selection of lamentations from our hypocritical Western colleagues about what Russian troops have been carrying out in recent days, strikes targeting military infrastructure-related targets and infrastructure related to military. They were indeed very impressive and effective. From among the targets that were struck is the Military Institute in Poltava, which was training specialists in communications, a hotel in Kryvyi Rog where officers of the Ukrainian intelligence services were residing. A number of important energy infrastructure were also destroyed, as well as aerodrome infrastructure of Ukraine, fuel depots, arsenals of Western aircraft weapons and artillery munitions, storage site and manufacturing sites for UAVs, areas of storage for uncrewed vessels, and areas for the accommodation for units of nationalist units and foreign mercenaries. A distinguishing feature of this spate of strikes was a significant the increase in the number of foreign instructors, specialists, and mercenaries. For this reason, those who are following this issue can anticipate a large number of obituaries about the sudden demise of highly specialized US, British, French, Polish, and Swedish military personnel. We, from the very beginning, cautioned that those who arrived to help the Zelensky maintain its military capabilities afloat or fighting to fight in its ranks will become targets of our legitimate targets for us. And those who are dying include more and more citizens from Western states. And this merely shows that the West is completely enmeshed in the Ukrainian conflict and now is undertaking tremendous efforts in order for the Zelensky regime to somehow be maintained afloat. And these efforts, of course, include the continuous deliveries to the Kyiv junta of Western weapons, which we will discuss in detail during the meeting we requested to be held on 13 September. There have unfortunately been tragedies that are now the hallmark of the Ukrainian anti-air defense systems, which are experiencing difficulties. On the 30th of August in Kharkov, there 7 people tragically died, including a child, and another 77 people, including 18 children, died as well. The anti-air defense, which had failed, was supposed to have destroyed itself, but this did not take place. There were other similar incidents that also took place. The reason for this is, as was the case in the past, and we repeatedly pointed to those reasons, the fact that Ukrainian anti-air systems are being placed in residential areas in violation of the principles of IHL, compliance with which our Western colleagues continuously call for. It would probably be useful for them to learn that the Ukrainian armed forces are not only openly placing firing positions in schools, kindergartens, and hospitals, but they are also transferring and having military vehicles be used as ambulances, and school buses are being used in the same way for military purposes. 2 such buses with the letters children had a collision in Ukraine in recent days, and the fact that military personnel were there was documented on social networks of the outraged Ukrainian users. In recent days, we have been carrying out strikes, and they have been very painful for the Kyiv regime, and there's hysteria as a result with Western colleagues. And my question to you, Western colleagues, what did you expect when the Ukrainian leader, who instead of engaging in peace talks, he and his subordinates engaged in contacts with mediators from the global, instead of contacts with the global south, embraced the path of the Kursk misadventure and sent powerful, largely Western prepared fist and targeting the peaceful adjacent to Russia region. You did not warn him that these are actions that will result in reprisals and irrevocable punishment. And their Ukrainian nationalists killed 3 children, 10-year-old, 3 children from 10 to 12 years old in Malaya Loknya. Media outlets also had images of the Banderites reprisals targeting ordinary civilians in that residential area who had convened at the square for further evacuation. And in Malay Lokna, at that point, there alone, approximately 10 people became casualties. The Ukrainian troops are abducting civilians who have not had the opportunity to evacuate. There's documented information and data about sexual violence by the mercenaries and Ukrainian radicals targeting civilians, and the Ukrainian soldiers who became POWs have acknowledged that the command has been instructed to fire upon civilians in Kursk Oblast if they are to resist, and we have video evidence that corroborates such criminal orders. All of you here who have said nothing about the crimes of the Ukrainian armed forces on the soil of Kursk, and nor did you mention the numerous instances of the Kyiv regime firing on peaceful Russian cities. And this has taken place in recent days. On the 20th of August in Zaporozhye Oblast, the Ukrainian armed forces used drones with munitions to target civilian vehicles. As a result, 1 child died on the spot and another 4 people were wounded. And draw your attention to the fact that drone operators have their targets perfectly visible to them, which makes such attacks deliberate. On the 29th of August, 5 Ukrainian drones targeted strikes against a hospital in Kherson Oblast. A nurse was wounded. On the 30th of August, they deliberately fired on Belgorod and the Belgorod region with cluster munitions from the Czech-made MLRS, the Vampire MLRS. 5 civilians died, dozens were wounded, including minors, and numerous residential buildings and homes were destroyed, as were vehicles and other civilian objects. On the 1st of September, the Zelensky regime undertook a large-scale attack targeting 15 Russian regions. The aircraft intercepted and destroyed 158 various unarmed uncrewed lethal vehicles. On the 2nd of September, the Kyiv junta targeted a deliberate attack with missiles against a kindergarten in Belgorod. This was completely destroyed. Fortunately, there were no casualties, thanks to the fact that the works of kindergartens and other schools was stopped in areas that were not deemed safe. The conduct of large-scale attacks targeting densely populated areas on the 1st to the 2nd of September, that is the beginning of the school year, when many children were just beginning to attend school, points to the fact that it was indeed children who were the main target of the Kyiv regime. On the 3rd of September, the Ukrainian drones targeted churches and social objects in Gruskaya and Belgorodchina, deliberately dropping explosives on the area. At the same time, there were 10 people at the church at the time, worshippers and workers. As a result, a priest was concussed. On that same day in Donetsk, the Sokol market was struck, as a result of which 2 children died. They were born in 2011 and 2009, and a man died as well. 8 people were wounded, including children. Overall, since February 2022, in Belgorod Oblast, 16,434 instances of shelling of civilian infrastructure was reported, including 9,306 instances of artillery and MLRS, and 7,128 instances with drones. And this resulted in the deaths of 245 civilians, including 17 children. 1,483 people were wounded, including 112 children. 34,600 civilian objects have been damaged. Since the 1st of August alone, as a result of strikes by the Kyiv regime targeting Belgorod's Oblast, 10 local civilians died, 157 were wounded, of them 14 were children. 2 hospitals were damaged, 13 shopping centers and stores, 2 houses of culture, 5 administrative buildings, an Orthodox church, industrial site, 2 pipelines, 4 power lines, a station, and 48 residential buildings, 1,037 apartments, as well as 140 private homes, 446 vehicles, and a number of agricultural infrastructure sites. There were strikes against Russian areas, as a result of which there are dead and wounded. I wish to stress that in direct proximity to these objects, there was neither military infrastructure nor were there any military personnel. To be frank, we are no longer at all surprised at the blatant double standards of the Western sponsors of the Kyiv regime. They have selective blindness in these cases, of which they have demonstrated for all 8 years, while the Kyiv regime, inter alia, using the cover of the Minsk agreements, as they shelled the civilian cities in Donbass, towns and cities in Donbass. The same blindness is something which the US and satellites has when the Kyiv junta demonstrates and manifests its Nazi essence. Not only is it glorifying Nazi henchmen and Hitlerite henchmen who are responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of innocent Jews, Poles, Russians, Roma, and Ukrainians who were murdered by the Nazi Ukrainian tormentors and executioners. This is clear to all that the Ukrainian military personnel have posted paraphernalia and images on the internet, not even trying to conceal their Nazi paraphernalia, symbolism, flags, and emblems. The courage only very few in the West can summon the courage to acknowledge this shameful issue. For example, the Prime Minister of Slovakia, during a visit to the Holocaust Museum in one of the Slovak cities, decided that it was possible to stress, and I quote, "We are all talking about fascism, Nazism. At the same time, we are silently tolerating the fact that in Ukraine, troops are rampant who have a very clear intention linked to movements which we believe are dangerous and that are prohibited. The international community needs to recognize that we cannot allow for in Ukraine troops to fight who use Nazi symbolism and frequently comport themselves as such. Once again, I stress this kind of rhetoric is something which we frequently hear in the West. We frequently encounter attempts to either sweep under the rug the facts which are inconvenient to the Kyiv regime, or even to play into the hands of Ukrainian propagandists. For example, the position of Canada, whose authorities actively have been considering whether or not it is worth, as was planned at the urgence of the victims of the Holocaust, to publicize the list of 900 Nazi criminals who fled to that country after the defeat of fascist Germany. The arguments advanced against this step included the following: that the disclosure of the names is liable to make the Ukrainian community of Canada feel uncomfortable, as if this did not take place a year ago, when in September 2023, in the House of Commons in Canada, there was a commemoration for the 14th Voluntary Infantry Division of the SS, the Galiciina Division. I refer to Yaroslav Glinko, who personally was welcomed by the head of the who participated during the visit and was honored when the head of the Kyiv regime visited. It is hardly surprising that under such circumstances, this is something that the West is trying to cover up. The Nazism in Ukraine is flourishing entirely. Nazi criminals, and for example, the Ukrainian mission in Japan announced in its account on X on the 3rd of September, the ambassador of Ukraine to Japan, Karasunsk, on September 3rd, Ambassador Sergei Karasunsky paid tribute to the Sukuni Shrine and mourned those who lost their lives for the country. And this, as we know, these are, as we are aware, 14 military criminals, Class A criminals, who were condemned by the International Criminal Tribunal for the Far East, which is known as the Tokyo trial, whose ashes are in Yasukuni, and they, as the Ukrainian are deemed to be, as the Ukrainian diplomat has determined to be, that they have lost their lives for their country. The main Japanese media outlets simply ignored this event, and the Japanese government continues as if nothing happened to provide cover for the Kyiv regime and to provide them with weapons as well. I wish in this connection to draw attention to the following. That date, the 3rd of September, was hardly a coincidence. On that date, 3 September, in Russia and in many countries, the 79th anniversary of the victory over militarist Japan and the end of the Second World War were commemorated. Clearly, this initiative by the Ukrainian representative was dictated by attempts to rewrite history. Mr. President, in Russia, we will never tolerate attempts to whitewash those who perpetrated war crimes and crimes against humanity in a number of Western countries. Specifically, from the Japanese leadership, there has still been no repentance for the aggression against a host of states, including the USSR in the Far East, which incidentally was the condition for its acceptance as a member of the United Nations. At the same time, Tokyo and Western allies are so arrogant as to advance ambiguous and inappropriate allegations alleging that the USSR is responsible for the outbreak of the Second World War. Under these circumstances, it is hardly illogical that in recent years, the Western camp, including Germany, Japan, and Italy have voted against the annual resolution, which we have submitted on the inadmissibility of the glorification of Nazism and the whitewashing of Nazi criminals. Western policy against the Kyiv regime clearly shows that the fight against Nazism and neo-Nazism is not a part of its plans today, and yet it is a part of our plans, and we will not tolerate the presence of Nazis or neo-Nazis on our soil, and this is one of the goals and objectives of our special military operation. So have no doubt, Ukrainian Nazis and militarists will meet the same fate as their German and Japanese predecessors. Thank you for your attention.
Thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Mr. President, thank you for convening this meeting at the request of the delegations of Ecuador and France. I thank Acting Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, Ms. Joyce Musia, for her briefing. Sierra Leone is deeply concerned about the escalating security situation and the deteriorating humanitarian situation relating to the conflict in Ukraine. The conflict has been ongoing for 2.5 years with seemingly no end in sight. In recent months, the conflict has escalated drastically and the battlefield has expanded as both Russia and Ukraine have reportedly intensified their offensives. From the Human Rights Monitoring Mission to Ukraine, HRMMU report of 9th August 2024, Sierra Leone notes an alarming increase in civilian casualties since March this year, with July being the deadliest month with at least 209 civilians killed and 1,018 injured. The number of civilian casualties, particularly in Ukraine, for August are similarly alarming, with at least 184 civilians killed and 856 injured. Ukraine's emergency service has reported that Russia carried out the deadliest single attack of this year on the east central Ukrainian town of Poltava on Tuesday, 3rd September 2024, with 328 people injured and 55 reported dead from the ongoing rescue operation. The Russian Defense Ministry reported on Wednesday that the precision strike in the central Ukrainian city of Poltava had targeted a Ukrainian Armed Forces Center where foreign instructors trained communications, electronic warfare specialists, and drone operators. Sierra Leone takes note of Ukraine's letter of Wednesday, 4th September 2024, reporting of major attacks carried out that same day in the western city of Lviv and the central city of Kryvyi, which also resulted in civilian injuries and deaths, including children. The attacks also reportedly resulted in significant damage to civilian infrastructures, such as schools, educational facilities, medical institutions, stores, and at least 7 local architectural monuments, all buildings located in the city's historic area and UNESCO buffer zone, which aims to protect World Heritage property. Earlier today, Russian officials reported a large-scale Ukrainian drone attack on populated areas in Moscow, resulting in 1 death and damage to housing facilities. The attack resulted in the closure of 3 of Moscow's 4 airports for several hours and diversion of almost 50 flights. Sierra Leone reiterates that attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure are prohibited under international law. We call on all sides to ensure compliance with applicable international law, including international humanitarian law. Mr. President, Sierra Leone is deeply concerned about the immense impact of the conflict on civilians. This is more so the case in Ukraine. According to HRMMU reports, relentless attacks on frontline oblasts and urban centers across Ukraine continue to destroy homes, hospitals, schools, railway infrastructure, and energy facilities. Entire neighborhoods and villages have been destroyed. A major children's hospital in Kyiv was recently attacked. It is recorded that 35,160 civilian casualties, including 11,520 deaths, have occurred and more than 20,000 injured since the conflict began on 24th February 2022. According to OCHA flash update on 6 September 2024, intensive attacks and shifts in the front line have resulted in the closure of basic public services, forcing millions of people to flee high-risk locations in Donetsk Oblast, separating families and exacerbating the humanitarian crisis. Reported attacks against Ukraine's energy infrastructure since March 2024 have drastically reduced the country's electricity capacity, leading to daily power cuts for millions of people across Ukraine. These outages often last many hours, limit access to water, mobile networks and internet and public transportation, and disrupt children's ability to study, as many in Ukraine attend school remotely. Vulnerable groups, especially older people and persons with disabilities, have been particularly affected by these disruptions in essential services. Sierra Leone is deeply concerned over this development as Ukraine approaches its third winter since the start of the conflict in February 2022. We note that to address the winter-specific needs, the humanitarian community launched the 2024-2025 Winter Response Plan, appealing for $492.1 million United States dollars to support 1.8 million people with critical winter-related humanitarian assistance, as outlined in the 2024 Humanitarian Needs and Response Plan. This plan intends to support timely preparedness and response. Only 28% of the 2024 humanitarian appeal have been received as of the end of June, a significant funding shortfall. Sierra Leone calls upon the international community to support this plan to address the pressing needs of the people, enhance living conditions, and ensure access to essential services. Mr. President, the attacks on nuclear energy infrastructure over the past 2 months pose serious security threats, not only for Ukraine and Russia, but for the entire region. We note comments by IAEA Chief Grossi on his recent trip to the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, warning against further attacks on the plant, which could further destabilize it, resulting in a nuclear disaster. We urge both parties to the conflict to refrain from launching attacks on nuclear power plants in both Ukraine and Russia. The alarming civilian casualty figures and humanitarian crisis in Ukraine underscores the urgent need for all parties to the conflict to prioritize the protection of civilians and refrain from further escalation and pursuit of the option of winning the war on the battlefield at all costs. Dialogue and diplomacy should be the primary tools employed to de-escalate tensions and pave the way for a peaceful resolution of the conflict. The international community, including this council, must remain steadfast in its commitment to supporting the pursuit of a just and sustainable peace. Sierra Leone once more calls for good faith diplomatic efforts in pursuit of a peaceful resolution involving the parties to the conflict. Meaningful steps must be taken towards the immediate de-escalation and cessation of the hostilities. We urge parties to the conflict to engage constructively, including on their legitimate concerns, to find a political and diplomatic solution as envisaged in Article 33 of the UN Charter. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I thank the Acting Under-Secretary General, Joyce Msuya, for her briefing. I also welcome the representative of Ukraine in today's meeting. Mr. President, we remain profoundly concerned with the prevailing situation in Ukraine as the security situation continues to deteriorate at an alarming scale. The consequences of this conflict have reached unprecedented levels of catastrophic severity, inflicting immeasurable human suffering. Regrettably, civilians continue to pay the ultimate and highest price arising from this conflict. We witness with great distress the ongoing loss of lives, injuries, human rights violations, massive forced displacements, refugees, and destruction of critical civilian infrastructure, including homes, schools, hospitals, water, gas, and power systems. As this conflict persists without signs of abatement and with prospect for a mutually acceptable solution remaining elusive, we sadly anticipate a further deterioration of the already dire security and humanitarian situation. According to the UNDP, the level of destruction in Ukraine represents the loss of 18 years of socio-economic development progress. The estimated cost of reconstruction and recovery exceeds 448 billion over the next decade. Mr. President, while acknowledging that there is no humanitarian solution for this man-made crisis, our position on the humanitarian dimension of these and other conflicts is consistent and remains unchanged. We reiterate once again our four main points. Firstly, the protection of civilians is the cornerstone of the international humanitarian law. We therefore call on all parties to ensure their safety and fulfill their obligations in this regard. Secondly, the principles of distinction, precaution, and proportionality must be scrupulously adhered and upheld by all parties at all times. Thirdly, all parties must facilitate full, safe, rapid, and unhindered access for humanitarian personnel and relief to civilians in need. Lastly, ending this conflict is the only way to address its severe humanitarian consequences. In light of these considerations, we reiterate our call for an urgent and immediate cessation of hostilities and a return to direct negotiations without any preconditions. Such negotiations should consider the legitimate security concerns of all involved parties with the aim of ensuring a peaceful, sustainable, and lasting solution. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Acting Undersecretary General Joyce Msuya for the update provided and welcome the participation of the representative of Ukraine. We note with alarm the recent escalation in hostilities since the Council's last briefing on Ukraine. The past 2 weeks in particular have seen harrowing reports of multiple civilian casualties across several regions in Ukraine. These continued attacks against critical civilian infrastructure, including energy infrastructure, represent a persistent pattern of violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law. According to OHCHR, August recorded the second highest number of civilian casualties for the year, no doubt exacerbated by the large-scale coordinated attacks that struck Ukraine during the week of 26th of August. Attacks that not only resulted in the killing of 8 civilians, but also caused widespread damage to energy facilities in 15 regions. We also note the reports of civilian casualties sustained in the Kursk region of the Russian Federation, and the notable increase in attacks on schools and hospitals in Ukraine. Mr. President, innocent civilians must not continue to pay the ultimate price in this war. Guyana reiterates its demand for an immediate end to the indiscriminate and disproportionate attacks and calls for full adherence to international humanitarian law. We also reiterate that every member state of the United Nations has an obligation to uphold the UN Charter and the wider body of international law. We further call upon the parties to the conflict to take constant care to spare civilians and civilian objects from harm and to take all necessary measures to minimize the risk of civilian injury, death, and damage to civilian infrastructure. Mr. President, colleagues, this Council continues to meet month after month to discuss the armed conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Yet each month, we leave these chambers without making any meaningful progress that would stop the bloodshed and bring relief to civilians. Today, the death toll has reached almost 12,000 and is expected to climb even higher in the months to come. It is worth reminding that this Council has the responsibility to maintain international peace and security. It is simply not enough to acknowledge the horrors of this war, including the rising death toll. This Council must do more to stop the carnage and avoid normalizing the suffering of innocent civilians. Civilians are not collateral damage. As we have done before, Guyana demands an immediate end to the hostilities and urges the parties to commit to a serious political and diplomatic process toward ending the conflict and to engage in good faith. Mr. President, this war will leave behind a legacy of destruction and prolonged economic and social challenges. The psychological trauma and residual effects will also be acutely felt for generations to come. This is why it must end. Guyana therefore reiterates its call for the Russian Federation to immediately withdraw its military forces from the international recognized territory of Ukraine and find a peaceful end to this conflict. We further call upon the Russian Federation to allow unfettered humanitarian access to the people in need of humanitarian assistance in the occupied territories and to sign an action plan with the United Nations to end and prevent grave violations against children. The international community must also scale up support for the Humanitarian Needs and Response Plan and the Winter Response Plan. In closing, Mr. President, I once again reiterate Guyana's support toward all efforts aimed at ending this war and achieving sustainable peace for the people of Ukraine. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank Acting USG Masuya for her comprehensive briefing. As we discussed last week, the massive and widespread missile barrage on Ukraine continue unabated. The United Nations has also reported a high number of civilian casualties. We are appalled by the scale of devastation, and we strongly condemn these attacks. Our deepest condolences and sympathies are extended to the families and friends of those who were victimized in Ukraine. We also keep in our thoughts those who were injured and wish them a speedy recovery. Let us emphasize this once again. There must be no impunity for war crimes and other atrocities, including attacks against civilians and critical civilian infrastructure. Those responsible for these heinous acts must be held accountable. Mr. President, Russia, a permanent member of the Security Council, which should be a guardian of the international order based on the rule of law, is openly breaking international law through aggression against another sovereign country in an attempt to change the status quo by force. Russia is also blatantly violating Security Council resolutions by procuring ballistic missiles from North Korea to use against Ukraine. These conducts and the facts are truly serious challenges to the global peace and security system. Such disgraceful attempts must fail. Otherwise, it could signal the collapse of the international order and the replacement of the rule of law with rule by force, where might makes right. Most of our colleagues here and the overwhelming majority of the international community will never accept such a world. We remain committed to the principled position we have upheld consistently, which is grounded in the UN Charter. Let us be clear, the purposes and principles of the Charter are non-negotiable. Peace in Ukraine must be achieved in accordance with the Charter. Today, the representative of Russian Federation maliciously make remarks on Japan. Their remarks are totally unacceptable and do not reflect the facts and achievements that Japan has been making for the past almost 80 years. Since the end of World War II, Japan has consistently followed the path of a peace-loving nation, actively contributing to peace, stability, and prosperity in the region and beyond. It is the Russian Federation that disturbs the international order based on the rule of law and the UN Charter is seeking. Mr. President, since the beginning of the aggression, Japan has provided Ukraine more than 12 billion US dollars, including humanitarian recovery and reconstruction assistance. Japan will continue to steadfastly and seamlessly support Ukraine's economic resilience and development, from emergency assistance and daily livelihood reconstruction to more advanced stages of industrial rebuilding. In conclusion, Mr. President, as a member of the Security Council, bearing a responsibility for international peace and security, as a country that stands by its principled position and a nation of peace, we continue to demand Russia's immediate, complete, and unconditional withdrawal from Ukraine. Our firm support for Ukraine is unwavering. Japan continues to stand with the people of Ukraine. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Japan for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. President, I wish to thank Acting Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, Ms. Joyce Masuya, for her briefing. Once again, this council is meeting in the wake of intense Russian attacks across Ukraine. In recent days, from the west to the east of the country, cities have been the target of waves of attacks. Some among them are the deadliest seen since the start of Russia's military aggression. The inhabitants of Lviv, Kryvyi Rih, Kharkiv, Poltava, Kyiv, and the Sumy and Donetsk regions, among others, continue to pay the price for this violence. Switzerland condemns these attacks, which affect civilians and civilian infrastructure. We are shocked by the number of victims, including many children, and by the significant damage done to homes, health, and educational facilities. Once again, indeed, education has been disrupted at the start of the new school year. Our thoughts go out to the victims and to their loved ones. We are particularly outraged to note attacks on areas where people who have fled the front lines have sought refuge, only to see their lives disrupted once more. Mr. President, it bears repeating. A war of aggression can never be justified. Moreover, wars have clearly defined limits under international law, which all parties to a conflict must respect in all circumstances. Notably, parties must at all times respect the principle of distinction between civilians and combatants and between civilian and military objects. Directing attacks against the civilian population and civilian objects constitutes a war crime. Furthermore, in the conduct of hostilities, all feasible precautions must be taken in order to avoid the loss of civilian life and damage which may be done to civilian objects. In-depth and independent investigations into these serious attacks must be conducted, and those responsible must be held accountable. Mr. President, the work of humanitarian partners in Ukraine is invaluable. In the first 6 months of this year, aid organizations provided assistance to 5.6 million people. Civilians depend on this vital support every day. Switzerland hails the tireless efforts of humanitarian personnel, whether they be providing immediate aid alongside first responders after attacks or assisting those forced to flee areas close to the front lines. They often do this work at the risk of their own safety. International humanitarian law demands that all parties allow and facilitate humanitarian access to civilians in need. The humanitarian situation risks worsening further with cold season around the corner, not least because of the extensive damage done to infrastructure. 2 weeks ago, a large-scale attack by Russian forces on Ukrainian energy infrastructure, the 9th in 5 months, again caused considerable damage. We remain concerned about the impact of the deteriorating energy system on Ukraine's nuclear power plants. Consequently, we welcome the IEA's ongoing efforts to ensure nuclear safety and security in the region. Switzerland will continue to provide humanitarian aid. We support the UN Ukraine Humanitarian Fund and are providing contributions to it and are providing material support to the energy sector for the winter. At this critical juncture, coordinated international support is vital. It is crucial to act quickly and in a coordinated way to reduce the impact of mines and other explosive devices on populations. It is with this in mind that Switzerland, together with the Ukraine, is organizing the Ukraine Mine Action Conference on October 17th and 18th in Lausanne. We are counting on high-level participation from all the countries involved in this effort. However, in order to achieve lasting improvement, this war must end. We call on Russia to withdraw its troops from Ukrainian territory. We remain determined to contribute to a just and lasting peace in Ukraine in accordance with the United Nations Charter. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for their statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Slovenia. I would like to thank Ms. Masuya for her briefing. After the last time the Council met on this topic, when the Okhmadit Children's Hospital was hit in early July, killing and destruction across Ukraine has been intensifying. Since then, more than 1,700 long-range weapons systems, including missiles and drone strikes, have hit homes, schools, and hospitals. According to WHO, more than a third of global attacks against healthcare facilities during the months of June and July occurred in Ukraine. As we have heard in one of the previous briefings, July has been the deadliest month for civilians in almost 2 years. Sadly, the escalation continued, as it became clear with the August 26 strike, when Russia launched what seems to have been the largest air assault since the war began. More than 200 drones and missiles were launched to hit targets across Ukraine. Unabated, these attacks have continued throughout last week, killing dozens of people and injuring hundreds, damaging and destroying civilian infrastructure in multiple cities throughout Ukraine, from Lviv to Poltava, from Sumy to Zaporizhia. Moreover, the UN has repeatedly documented Russia's double-tap strike tactics against civilians and first responders, which is a grave violation of international humanitarian law and may constitute a war crime. As we heard from Ms. Masuya, when it comes to critical civilian infrastructure, the energy infrastructure ends up in the crosshairs of Russian missiles particularly often. Reportedly, Russia destroyed 80% of Ukraine's thermal energy generation and a third of its hydro generation capacity. Just in June, 33 attacks on energy infrastructure were registered. Let me be clear, this is not legitimate military targets, and these attacks clearly run counter to the provisions of international humanitarian law. The only goal here is to oppress the civilian population and make their lives harder during the approaching winter months. There were no exceptions to this tactic in the last few weeks, when mainly electricity distribution infrastructure was targeted. This had far-reaching consequences for nuclear safety and security, as the widespread strikes caused major fluctuations in the power supply and led to the temporary shutdown or disconnection of reactor units in 2 Ukrainian nuclear power plants. Colleagues, the nuclear safety and security situation in the region is perilous, and we need to ensure full respect of the 7 indispensable pillars for nuclear safety and security, and the 5 basic principles for the protection of Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. A nuclear accident in the midst of war would be devastating for the whole region and would have global impacts. The Council must engage in order to address and prevent this from happening. I resume my function as President of the Council. The representative of China has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give them the floor.
President, I'd like to respond briefly to the statement by the United States. China's position on the Ukraine issue has been crystal clear, namely promoting peace talks and advocating for a political settlement. That's what we've been saying, and we always do what we say. Thus far, all the diplomatic efforts by China serve only one goal, and that only goal is peace. Our diplomatic efforts do not side with anyone or favor anyone. What we observe are the purposes and principles of the UN Charter. What we respect are the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries. We hope that the US can make genuine efforts toward an early ceasefire instead of constantly boasting about the great amount of weapons it has supplied to the conflict. Less still should it smear or attack the genuine efforts by China and other countries. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Well, thank you, Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, acting Under Secretary General Msuya. I also recognize the continuing occupation of the seat of the Soviet Union by the dictator's envoy, or rather the presence of a lonely young Russian diplomat abandoned by her cowardly adult male colleagues. The whining of the Russian envoy about a defense operation on Russian territory is a striking contrast to Putin's radio silence and the Russian Ministry of Defense denial of events on Russian territory. It is not for the first time that the Russian envoy is out of tune with his masters. Let's recall the night of the full-scale invasion in this chamber. We have addressed the Security Council with a request to convene this meeting due to the recent spike of missile terror by Russia against Ukrainian people and critical infrastructure. This escalation is causing widespread suffering and devastation and must be addressed before it leads to an even larger humanitarian catastrophe. It speaks volumes that we are meeting in this chamber simultaneously with participating in the opening of the 79th session of the UN General Assembly, taking place right now. This will be the 4th session during the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and it opens not with the fanfare that usually accompanies the beginning of a new General Assembly annual cycle, but with the explosions of ballistic missiles and the cries of wounded Ukrainian civilians. Indeed, if Russia had not started this war, we could have been sitting in the General Assembly hall, sharing positive expectations for the forthcoming 80th anniversary of our organization. Instead, we hear the Secretary General's acknowledgement that today's global order simply does not work for anyone. Instead, we hear the former PGA admitting that we do not have the capacity, nor do we have the mission to force Russians to respect international law. Meanwhile, on the eve of the Summit of the Future, we are debating whether we can even use the word aggression in its final document. And all this time, Russia continues to openly wipe their feet on the UN Charter and to kill Ukrainians. This is what we have today, and if it does not change, it will shape our future, a future that will differ drastically from the vision to be enshrined in the Pact for the Future. The series of recent tragedies in Ukraine occurring almost daily indicates that the war of annihilation against my country continues fueled by blind hatred and a criminal instinct to kill and destroy. The UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine reported at least 184 civilians killed and 856 injured in Ukraine in August, the second highest monthly number of civilian casualties in 2024, immediately after July. This means that Russia